When reviving a retro series and modernizing it, one of the key questions developers need to ask is what limitations should be preserved, especially in the case of Ninja Gaiden on the NES, where that entire game's identity is due to limitations, because the original Ninja Gaiden is actually an arcade beat-em-up, but during that era they obviously would not be able to recreate that style of gameplay on an NES, and so instead they smartly decided, alright, we're going to have to reinterpret this style of game design into a new framework, and so that's why Ninja Gaiden on the NES is this side-scrolling action platformer type of thing, and why the NES has so many platformers. So when doing a modern revival of a classic series like this, how much of a responsibility do the new developers have towards maintaining the mechanical identity of the original? Because I personally am only interested in this game because of the IP, and I'm sure many other people feel that same way. And so when I think of classic Ninja Gaiden, I'm reminded of brutal, punishing level design. So the question is, can this identity be accomplished without the limitations of the original series? Because I would say the secret sauce of Ninja Gaiden is mechanical limitation. Without limitations, the game doesn't have that much of an identity. And so what are these limitations? First off, when you attack, you have to stop moving. You can't swing your sword and run at the same time. That's Strider. In Ninja Gaiden, attacks take commitment. On top of that, when you swing your sword, you'll notice that you have a good amount of horizontal range, but not a lot of vertical coverage. And so that means there is a distinction between when you're rising in the air and you attack, like an early swing, versus when you're landing and you attack, because you need to aim and hit that sword swing in terms of timing and hitboxes. And then also when you're jumping, you cannot turn around and swing the other direction. And so this is one reason why birds are such a bane in the NES version, is because if you jump out and you mistime your swing, you can't just turn around and catch them going the other direction. You have to land, turn back around, and recommit to another jump. And so it creates that really nice rhythm and flow to the game's level design, where you feel like every interaction has that one opportunity, that one timing you need to hit. And if you miss it, oh crap, you're off route and you're scrambling. Another important aspect of that is, of course, the enemies respawning. This, I am sure, is due to some kind of hardware limitation, but it's actually a very strong point of game design, because it prevents you from being able to just cheese your way past a lot of the game's level design in terms of the enemies, because even if you manage to lure the enemy back off screen, that doesn't matter because they'll just respawn right there anyway. And so you have to deal with the enemies as they're meant to be laid out. It's like a protection mechanism for the level design. And I think it's really important for this style of action platformer, where the key obstacle is not pits like you get in Super Mario Bros. The key obstacle are the enemies. And so by not being able to lure them away from their designated areas and having to deal with them where they're supposed to be, at least for the most part, I think that aspect of the game's level design, that limitation, is very important. And you'll notice all these things I'm pointing out are not replicated at all in Ragebound. So in Ragebound, you can run while swinging your sword. In Ragebound, you can turn around in the air while swinging your sword. The enemies do not respawn. Ironically, the only enemies that do respawn are enemies that are supposed to help you by bouncing off of them. Those will respawn, but the enemies that are supposed to be blocking you or preventing you from moving forward, no, they don't respawn. And so even though on paper, when you look at Ragebound and you look at Ninja Gaiden NES, I think the aesthetics of Ragebound are awesome. I think the vibes of Ragebound are awesome. But in terms of its fundamental feel and approach, it is an entirely different game. And I think it's a valid question to ask, as these limitations are removed, what about this is necessarily Ninja Gaiden? And I was reading a developer interview where they said they did not want to make Ragebound into a Metroidvania. They wanted to honor the linear style of the NES Ninja Gaidens, which I agree with. In concept, yes, I like the linear style, but it's like you can take the developer out of the Metroidvania, but you can't take the Metroidvania out of the developer, because you can see a lot of their instincts, a lot of their decision making with Ragebound is much more informed by their previous history of making Metroidvanias than it is a linear action platformer like a Ninja Gaiden NES or like a Castlevania, because of the lack of these limitations. In a Metroidvania, freeform movement and low commitment attacks make sense because the primary method of gameplay is actually map traversal. The maps are giant and they have multiple entrances and exits, and so the levels and mechanics need to be designed around mobility and shifting past enemies like their speed bumps. But in an action platformer like Ninja Gaiden, the enemies are actually the core emphasis of the level design, not the platforms, and so you need a certain amount of limitation of the player mechanics in order to keep this style of gameplay viable. And so as much as I appreciate Ragebound's linear approach, mechanically it's much more rooted in a
Metroidvania style,
which is going to have a domino effect on everything else, beginning with the level and enemy design. One of the biggest hallmarks of Ninja Gaiden on the NES is what I call the solid difficulty of that game. And by solid difficulty, I mean that the game just does not allow you to proceed forward without mastering its level design, without mastering its challenge. If you want to progress in the game, you need to learn the specifics of every individual level. You can't just fly through it understanding overall universal mechanics. But in today's modern style of level design, fairness has become almost a compulsion. It's become such a strong, obsessive balancing point that even if modern developers are trying to make something like Ninja Gaiden, they just can't bring themselves to fully do it, because whenever they see a hard memorization check or a hard trap, they look at it and go, nope, no, that cannot be allowed. There's got to be some kind of mechanic to fix this, right? And the best way I can describe modern attitudes towards fairness in level design is that a game should never have a hard memorization check the very first time you play. So there should never be a situation where you go to jump over a pit and then a bat spawns as you're jumping and just knocks you out of the air and kills you, and you would not have been able to respond to that bat unless you knew it was coming. That is something that is deemed unfair these days, but the problem with removing hard memorization checks like that from your level design is that you can never elevate it beyond a basic level. The problem with Ragebound is that it is so compulsively obsessed with fairness and with mechanical freedom that it simply cannot recreate the same style of level design as the original series. So for example, there's the classic bat section where if you do not know the layouts, if you do not know the bat's behavior, cue AVGN, you're just going to get owned by that.
It doesn't matter where you are, no matter which angle you get hit from, it always seems you gravitate towards the nearest hole. You know, I've forgotten that this game has a life bar. Yeah, you can actually die if you take enough hits, but whenever you get hit, there's a death trap right next to you, so you're always going to die by falling. You might as well not even have a life bar.
And every single enemy hit and interaction in the original Ninja Gaiden is a threat, because if you get hit, you get put into this stunned knockback state, and that's a hard committed state. You're just stuck in that state until you land. And so enemies are not just a threat in that game because of their ability to inflict damage on you. They're also a major threat in that game because of their ability to knock you into pits, to knock you off of platforms, which I think is a very important aspect of creating difficulty in this sort of system. But in Ragebound, I'm sure they're looking at the original NES game and they're like, well, the bats, that's a little much. So here's what we'll do. We'll add in an air tech system so that if you get hit in the air, like Super Smash Brothers, you'll gain another jump so you can air tech back onto route. And so that way you don't have these unfair sections where you get clipped by something and knocked into pits. The problem is that, okay, if you remove the ability for the enemies to knock you into pits and kill you, what threat are they? And then on top of that, let's give the player a bunch of movement mechanics. Then how do you constrain the player? It reminds me a ton of that section in Super Metroid when you're speedrunning. You just want to go through the crab guys, so you just sprint through them and take the damage. That is so many interactions with the enemies in this game because you have way too much control. You can control exactly where you are. You can control exactly what happens after you get hit. And then on top of that, you get constant health drops and constant checkpoints. And so if you're playing this game on normal, you can just essentially run through the entire game and
tank hits.
And the enemy design can't synergize with the level design because your player mechanics just overwhelm everything the developer would attempt to do, like sticking an enemy on a ledge. In NES Ninja Gaiden, an enemy on a ledge is a very serious obstacle because you can't just run through them or jump over them. You will get knocked back, usually into a pit. But in Ragebound, you don't need to know any specific situations throughout almost all of the game because you can just overwhelm everything with your mobility, with your low commitment attacks. And if that's not enough, we've got the ultimate Deus Ex Machina, the Guillotine Boost, or the Bounce, as I like to call it. This might be one of the most OP mechanics in all of action platformers. It puts air dash to shame because air dash you eventually have to land on the ground at some point. With the bounce, no you do not. And not only does the bounce give you another jump in the air, it gives you iframes, and then it has a fully circular hitbox. This thing is insane, and it is the game. Ninja Gaiden Ragebound should be called Ninja Gaiden Bounce because it fully destroys any semblance of this game's balance. The IGN review actually noticed this. They were just thrilled about it. Let's say they put an enemy on a ledge and then they put something where it would be kind of hard to iframe roll through it. And at first when I was playing the game, I thought the iframe roll would be the most broken thing until we found the bounce, because in any situation, almost ever, just bounce over it, bounce above it, bounce, 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 bounce. It cannot be stopped. The only place it kind of gets stopped is in boss fights, which is kind of funny. But outside of the boss fights, pretty much almost all of the level design can be circumvented by the bounce. And you must be thinking, no, because let's say you're in the air and you have an enemy with a gun or an enemy with a projectile. Couldn't they just shoot you out of the air? Wouldn't that be trade-off of using a jump and a bounce? Well, it turns out you can bounce off projectiles. So not only are enemies shooting at you not a threat, they sometimes actively help you because you can do like the P-Wing from Super Mario Bros. That's kind of how the bounce works in a lot of the stages. If the stages don't have a ceiling or the ceiling is kind of high, you can often just get over the top of a lot of the enemies and just bounce on top of them continually. And so in many platforming situations, because of all of these player mechanics, especially the bounce, they are like actively resources for you. And I know the developers are aware of this because they have many sections in their level design where they are asking you to bounce off the enemies. But I don't think they're quite aware of how broken this mechanic is, or maybe they just don't care. Definitely feels like with modern developers, they're not so much worried about the skilled players cheesing the game or breaking their systems. They're much more worried about the beginner players, the game journalists, who never in a million years will figure out how to abuse the mechanics, won't really think about the implications of these things, and they just want the game to play at this very safe surface level.
But what about Ninja Gaiden? Isn't this series supposed to be difficult?
And so that brings us to what I like to call self-serve difficulty. And this is definitely clearly a goal of Ragebound. And I think one reason why Ragebound has such positive reception and such high review scores. And I think the meta that we're seeing is that basically the entire game's difficulty and systems are going to be tailored to be the most generous possible. Because in a pure popularity sense, it's riskier to impose hard skill checks on newer players than it is to just softball legacy skilled players. Bog articulated this really well, where he said in classic design, the players are trying to find ways around the difficulty, so they may find broken strategies to overcome the difficulty. But in modern games, it's reversed, where you have to find the difficulty. And we get in these ridiculous situations now. I beat the game, it was so easy. Oh, well, did you find the high difficulty items? Did you find the difficulty? So yeah, in case you don't know, the way they are attempting to create difficulty for the legacy skilled players is by segmenting it off into these separate talisman items that debuff the player, and not telling the player, by the way, that these debuff talismans are actually required for the secret highest rank, which is S++. And so if you're a new player engaging with the normal talisman system and getting S ranks, you have no idea that you're not engaging with the game's full difficulty. You can only engage with it if you equip the talisman items first, then it shows the potential for the higher rank. I think this is a really naughty little option select, where the casual player doesn't feel like they are missing out or playing subpar, but for the dedicated player who seeks out the difficulty, then you feel extra smart by finding the secret hidden S++ rank item effect. This is very Metroidvania type of stuff. And why I don't think it's a good idea in the long run is because it takes the natural conversation between developer and player, where the game should be encouraging the player to push their skill set forward and to engage with the difficulty as openly and actively as possible. Instead, it takes that natural conversation and inverts it into this optional novelty, but then that just creates this massive missed opportunity for players who are not attempting to go against the natural difficulty of the game, because the natural incentive of the player is always to subvert the difficulty, not to increase it. So this type of system is sanding against the grain, and I think why developers are opting for it now, because we see something similar with the difficulty sliders in the Doom Dark Ages, is by making the player self-serve difficulty. What the developer is doing is offloading the responsibility of that difficulty on the player. And so if playing with these debuffed items is funky or unbalanced, well, that's not the developer's fault. You chose this. Why don't you just unequip them? There's a business strategy around this called the IKEA effect, where if you are responsible for making the furniture, or in this case, making the difficulty and the challenge, then you feel a sense of ownership and you feel more inclined to overlook any sort of balance issues or design problems. We're seeing this a lot these days. Whereas if this was a formal mode like Master Ninja, then you do have room to say, hey, this aspect of Master Ninja isn't well balanced, this aspect of Master Ninja isn't working. But if it's this separate challenge you opt into, then the developer can just throw it in at the end and doesn't need to worry about making it official content. At least there's hard mode, right? So Ragebound on normal is so easy that even Polygon pointed it out, though of course they loved that. And I wouldn't really care that much, except it's required that you have to play through normal mode. This is one of my least favorite things about 3D Ninja Gaiden, the fact that you have to unlock the higher difficulties. But I would say the equivalent of playing Ragebound on normal is like playing the easy mode of Ninja Gaiden Sigma or something like that. It is so easy that it's basically just an extended loading screen until you unlock the game's hard mode. And I think this is the developer's sort of answer to the legacy skilled players. They mentioned that in the interview that they did. And it would make sense that, okay, at least they have that hard mode in there. And when you first start playing it, especially the first stage where they go back through all the fire area and they add tons of flames and tons of different sections like falling meteorites and stuff. They really went in and reworked that first fire stage to give you the impression, oh wow, hard mode is going to be a really distinctive experience. This really is like the true game. But the hard mode of Ragebound reminds me a lot of the expert mode of Star Fox 64, where you enter Corneria in expert mode and it's like a completely different stage with all these new enemy layouts, and you're like, whoa, expert mode's gonna be this crazy cool new experience. And then the rest of the game is basically just normal Star Fox 64 with higher damage and stuff like that. And that's exactly pretty much how Ragebound works, where that first fire stage, you can clearly see they put the most time and effort into, probably because it was on the demo. And then for the rest of the stages, maybe because the game is so massive, you can see they must have ran out of time or must have figured people wouldn't care at a certain point. But it goes from completely reworking the first few stages and actually meaningfully changing the gargoyle guy boss encounter by adding flames into the center of the screen, and then also adding these spikes into the second one. And you're thinking, oh wow, so they're gonna rework all of the boss fights, they're gonna rework the whole game. But as it goes on, it just tires out, and pretty much all of the other boss encounters are hardly different. They're just a little bit more aggressive, probably do a bit more damage. And then you get into the final secret stage and you're like, oh my god, the TLB, here it is. And it's just like this easy boss rush, especially because you can use the ninja girl and she is OP and 10 times better than the ninja boy. Quick note, they probably should have put a shot limit on her to somewhat keep her projectiles kind of balanced, but yeah. What ended up happening is by the time you get into the later sections of hard mode, I beat the final stage boss guy my very first try. That didn't seem meaningfully any different. And it just ends up being that they'll throw like spikes down here and there, or they'll have extra bonus enemy spawns. But the irony of the bonus enemy spawns, especially in some of the later stages that have more open ceilings, is that they kind of are useful to you rather than a menace, because like I was saying earlier, you can use the bounce to kind of pee-wing your way through the stages. My point being is that they're attempting to make hard mode somewhat of an improvement in terms of difficulty, but if you're just worrying about getting to the end of the stage and beating the stages like you would in the NES Ninja Gaiden, it's hardly a shift. The bounce is just too powerful. The player mechanics are just too powerful, and then they run out of steam anyway. And so in terms of difficulty, the game just doesn't have a solid baseline layer like the NES games do, or like the 3D games do with Master Ninja mode and that kind of thing. Instead, all of its difficulty is being offloaded into its ranking system, which is an interesting choice, and I do love me ranking systems, but something that's important to establish, I think, is that ranking systems, these secondary layers of difficulty, when done well on a strong foundation of existing difficulty, like we see in shoot 'em up games or like we see in Shadow of the Ninja Reborn, these systems are excellent because they add an extra dimension to engage with. But it's important to recognize that unless that level of baseline difficulty is there, it's still not going to be that compelling. It's the difference between playing for S ranks in Devil May Cry on easy mode versus playing for them on Dante Must Die. Yes, there's a certain amount of routing and strategy that you're going to have to apply in easy mode, but it doesn't have that counter tension of the pure survival difficulty like you'd see in Dante Must Die. And so while I do appreciate the ranking system being in the game, I kind of get the feeling that its implementation is more trying to replace the core difficulty of survival than it is trying to build and supplement it. And so I thought it would be interesting to do a full analysis of this ranking system, since it is the primary focus for legacy players. The primary strength of the ranking system is that it finally offers a counter incentive to just running past the enemies or bouncing over the top of them. And so you are now engaging with the game, I think, more along the lines of what the developer wants, where you have to beat the stage within a certain amount of time. You need to kill a certain amount of enemies in the stage. It's not all the enemies, but it's around all the enemies. and then you have a certain amount of a chain that you need to complete. And the way the chaining works, by the way, is just a very lenient timer. At first, I thought you would not be able to take hits that would break your chain. I think that would have been a better decision. Or if they incorporated the Hypercharge more directly into comboing, because this poor mechanic is just an orphan as it stands, and it's clearly something that's important to the developers, but when playing for survival, you mostly just bounce over the enemies, or at worst, iframe roll through them. You'll take the occasional Hypercharge when it presents itself, but it's not as much of a core focus when playing to survive as I think the developers wanted, so it makes sense to incorporate this mechanic more into the game's ranking system by maybe having it be what creates the chain timer, or by creating bonus chain kills or something like that. But as it stands now, it's just this basic interaction of it gets you a kill, and so in some situations, like the developer intends, you'll wait for the charge to appear and you'll chain enemies together, and isn't that nice? But a lot of the times it's just faster to rush down the enemy and slash them, or just go around them and find something else to kill. And so giving the Hypercharge mechanic a bonus property makes a lot of sense, because a ranking system should not just be asking how many enemies did you kill, it should actually be asking how did you kill the enemies, and it should be rewarding more sophisticated kills on the player's part, like taking out multiple enemies with a single Hypercharge. But as it stands now, the game has no real comment on if you're able to do that, if that matters. All that matters is checking off the list of getting the kills within the time period. And so that extra layer of enemy interaction depth that could have been possible with the Hypercharge having more bonus properties is left on the table. And so the neglect of the Hypercharge, I think, is a good overall example of how surface this ranking system is, where it's just this layer on top of the base level design, but they're not going to change things too drastically to accommodate the ranking system being more interesting or meaningful. Same thing with the lenient chain timer, because you can tell they didn't want to make the chain timer too tight, because that would have required them going in and manually placing linking enemy spawns or trying to rebalance the entire stage around the chain mechanic. So instead they're like, just make the chain extremely lenient and it'll work out for the most part. And it ends up being not that much of a factor. Basically, you just route out a certain section of the stage that will complete the chain requirement, and then you don't need to worry about it. And that is an overall symptom of this game's ranking system, where all of its elements, like the max kills, the chain timer, the time completion, all of them are isolated from one another. They don't have any internal conflict or any internal overlap, where if they developed this chain system more, and the chain or the Hypercharge, as I mentioned earlier, created some sort of bonus kill effect, then you could have the chain and then the total kill interacting, where if you keep the chain going throughout the entire stage, that would create bonus kills that would then carry over into the total kill requirement. And so you wouldn't have to statically go and kill as many enemies as you would if you didn't have a larger chain. But as it stands now, like I said, it all just is isolated. And so once you hit the chain requirement, just that's it. The dynamic's done. Don't even worry about it. Now it's an active liability because there's no overall goal beyond this checklist. And then on top of that, you've got the completion requirements that shift from stage to stage. And I think, again, these completion requirements are a good overall sign of kind of how thrown in this whole style system is, because based off of the stage, you can either get really interesting kind of challenging ones like don't get hit by the boss, but then you get ones like in the first stage where it's like kill 5 enemies with a lunge attack. So it really varies from stage to stage how meaningful these challenges are. And you can tell looking at even some of the later challenges that if you're playing for max rank, you'll find a ton of pointless things, like in stage 4 kill 150 enemies. You're already going to be doing that because the stage kill requirement is 300, or defeat the boss in one try. Again, if you're playing for max ranks, that's going to be something you're doing anyway. One of my favorite ones is in the motorcycle stage. where one of the challenges is to destroy this trap of a specific type, but it spawns on screen like literally right at the start of the stage. So it's like, boom, you did it. There's lots of little meaningless ones like that. And I get the logic behind it, which is that this is going to be a gradient of challenges. And so even though you fail one, you could still pass another. I understand that makes sense. But since the game has this whole system where you need to equip secret special items to get the full max ranks, the game should be aware, okay, when you have these secret special items equipped, okay, you're playing for max ranks. And then so what it should do is readjust the challenges, because without a granular scoring system, these challenges define what is considered skill in the game. And so if some of them are redundant, especially if you're trying to play for max rank, then it just reflects poorly on the overall depth of the rank system. Which leads into the final requirement for ranks, which is you need to collect the skull items and the collectibles in order to get the max completion. I actually was very confused on my early attempts because I was like fulfilling every requirement. Time, kills, combo, challenges. And then I wasn't getting the max S++, and I was sitting there like, why isn't this working? Turns out you have to collect the items as well, which in theory might be a good idea because it would add to the time pressure. But look at how it's adding to the time pressure with map navigation. So the main primary benefit of the ranking system, in my opinion, was its emphasis on combat and dealing with the enemies, that being finally a dynamic of the gameplay. But then by making you traverse and collect all the little hidden items, that once again brings back map navigation as one of the primary core skills and continues this trend of keeping the rank requirements separated from one another in their own little silos. Where if you look at Devil May Cry 3 and its red orb system, I think it's a much better approach, where yes, you can get red orbs in items on the map, so you can get a little bit of incentive to explore and pick stuff up, but you primarily also get red orbs from killing enemies with high style, which could have fed back into the combo system, which could have fed back into the hypercharge system. And so if there was a red orb type of system in this game, that could have connected together all three of these requirements in a very natural, cool way, and would have allowed for the player to individually route out, okay, I'm going to focus more on map and navigation, so I'll get my red orbs from the collectibles, or I'm going to focus more on enemy combat in the hypercharge, so I'll get my red orbs from the enemy interaction. Or maybe I'll do a little bit of both and maybe get some of the collectibles and then do some of the enemy combat and chaining. And that is what would give this style of rank more flexibility and dimension. And so you'll notice it feels much more like you're playing a racing game or much more like you're speedrunning for 100% map completion than it does feeling like you're playing
Ninja Gaiden.
The way I find myself as a player interacting with ranking systems is basically I get really connected to the baseline gameplay of something like a Devil May Cry or something like a Devil Daggers, and I want to push further. I want to explore the game more. And so then that's when the ranking system just naturally slides into place, like, hey, this is how you play optimally. But in Ragebound, because the survival difficulty is so chill, playing for ranks feels like its own distinctive experience, completely separated from just playing the game for survival, which I don't think quite works. It's a good attempt, but I don't think it quite nails it. And the reason why is because it's too external and it's too disjointed. It's this huge checklist of items that the developer wants you to complete, and doing all of the checklist all together can be an interesting meta challenge. But the problem is that it is so prescribed and so surface that once you've completed all the checklist, then there's nothing left to really do. It reminds me a lot of when you go grocery shopping and you just need to get all these different items all across the store, and you've only got 30 minutes to do it before you have to go to an appointment or something. Yeah, there's a challenge in that, but it's not as compelling and holistic as we see in really good ranking systems like in Devil May Cry, where there's a lot more internal interaction, and the question is not, can you complete the checklist, but how do you complete the checklist? It's kind of funny and ironic that the highlight of Ragebound are definitely the boss fights, which are pretty fun and challenging on hard mode, though I have found that once you learn them, the bosses struggle to break out of their preset patterns. It's interesting because the bosses aren't fully just running the same pattern over and over. They do seem to be responding to your positioning to some degree, but it also seems like their responses to your positioning are somewhat static, because like you'll see with my S++ rank boss fight, which needed to be a fast kill, I got him into a sequence where I know each pattern he'll do reliably. So I didn't have to guess, oh, what's he going to do next? So the bosses were definitely an improvement over the NES era, and action platformers tend not to have very strong boss fights, and so they were my favorite part of the game, but at the same time, this genre just does not suit itself as well for boss fights. And you'll notice as the game goes on, the boss fights get more static and less interesting. The final boss was really a letdown because that didn't feel significantly much different than the earlier boss fights. And I do feel like overall as a game, because it's so big and expansive, Ragebound loses steam near the end, and it's very front heavy in terms of the quality. That's the problem of making giant games. They just cannot sustain that amount of intensity and pace usually. They start to peter out. So overall, do I recommend Ragebound? I honestly don't know. The key strength of the game, if you're at all interested in it, is playing for ranks in hard mode. There's definitely some meat behind getting the S++ ranks. There's no doubt about it. And I can see someone enjoying the game for quite a while, going for those ranks, especially in the later stages. But the experience is still going to be pretty prescribed. I mean, there's literal checklists, and there's no granular scoring. So once you complete the challenge and the checklists, there's not a lot of dimension afterward. It's not like Devil May Cry 3, where even after you get the S ranks, there's still a lot of creativity and fun to be had with its systems and with its enemy design and stuff. No, once you have your route established, you're not going to find a lot of variation or systematic difficulty. And even playing for like a whole no-death run, because the game is so long and full of plenty of filler stages, even that is kind of a tedious undertaking, I can imagine. There's nothing distinctively Ninja Gaiden happening other than the aesthetics, which I will say look fantastic.
Blasphemous looks insanely good, graphically.
So the developers are obviously talented, but I just don't think they're a great fit for this style of design, which is as much a fault of Team Ninja for bringing them on as the developers themselves. So I don't know. This is probably just the meta that's going to continue onward. I don't dislike Ragebound, but I don't love it either. So I guess I'll leave it up to you all to decide if you want to pick it up, because I mean, there's a lot of amazing games out there that grab a lot earlier and are just more robust. Of course, Shadow of the Ninja Reborn being a very good counterpoint to Ragebound, I think. And so I'd recommend that wholeheartedly. And if you're interested in Ragebound, maybe you should get it and kind of compare them. I think that would be really interesting. So yeah, if you enjoyed this review, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. And I'm a full-time YouTuber, so if you can support me on Patreon, I would really appreciate that. The patrons are what make the channel happen, and there's lots of cool exclusive content on Patreon as well. Thanks so much. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons: 100, Absconditis, Eternal Solitude, Handhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Alderin, Alex Kors, Alexander Pfeiffer, AMH, Anthony A, Harbin Gordon, Arcade Hell, A Royal Guard, Arrow Viper, Ash FL, Au Ally, Autonamed, Baron Metzigerstein, Battle Mode, Basil Me Dazzle, Bellator Poeta, Ben Foster, Benjamin Shabalski, Beetle Dames, Boghog, Borgie22, Boston Crab, Brokeface, Brindale Swiftfoam, Brodequin the Lonely Poet, Bruh, Bohem, Captain Rhodes, Captain Shrimp, Catchright Studio, Cat and Crack, Cha, Chad Goulding, Chamor Decluet, J-Flip, Kristen SoCal, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Cipollino 0404, Clairvoyant Bongwater, Claire Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, CMD, Coast, Concreted, Cooksand 666, Cook Some Soup,
Koryo, Korn Hoglin, Cozy, Crew Expendable, CSP 3900, Kudo, CZR, Des Audio, DRK, Damian Thorne, Dan Matai, Danchi, Darren Griffin, That Guy, David Aldris, David Crespo, Dididum, Demian Smirnov, Duram, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Dio Domke, DJ 420 Praise It, Don Pedro, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Drayton Barrett Rathun, Duckies, Easter Egg, Eduardo Oquinta, Edvard, Elbin Senisev, Elias Alonso, Empty Disco, Eric Shrivner, Eric Houdini, Esteban Lizama, Evan Serafet, Explosive General Games, Fabio Picci, Falcus, Benich Mathai, Firez, Five Side, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Gabriel Forner, Game Soup, Game Boy Gru, Gelhoff, Gettershine, Gojira Green, GPM, Hawk, Hamadawama, Hans Kowalski, HDZ 274, Hero Death, Hamas Hardhat, Han Harthy, HUD, Humongous, HW Folder, Iran DMS, JDab, Jurgen, Jack Walsh, Jacob Foley, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, James Mosca, Jason, J McCarthy, J67, JLab, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, JMD, Joey Jojo Joestar, JOH, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Slayleyes, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Josh Mayer, Josie, JT, Julian Elwood, K, K2, Kane Evans, K-O-Tune, Ken10082, Kill All Music, King Joker, Kinstro, Contain, Praise the Boys, Kumawamu, Kumama, Kyarts, Kyrol, Leonard McCoy, Loberta, Lobos, Luna Lilich, LZR Cuter, Macabre Monster, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Mario Simic, Mark Mann, Mason Polar, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Matau Batau, Maz, Makaroka, Minong, Meister, Men's Raya 96, Metal Slime Drummer, Michael Del Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Mig ZDM, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morag, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Musashi, Miles P, Mishkin, Naps91, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Neon Ninja, Nervous J, Neuroshima, Nicholas Reichman, Nikki Negative, Nilfheim, Neo04, Okla Kugels, Oleg Talmasev, Panther Dragoon should have been arcade, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Howell Parole, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, Pizza Belly, Platinum Mad, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Psychovania, Queen Charlene, Quilon Jaeger, R2 Sinus, Raccoons, Raphael Trujillo, Randoom, Raul VP, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Rent Halt's Time, Repo Man, Retrojet, Retroman, Retro Schmupper, Richter, Riff Mason, Robert Chang, Roop Olander, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Running Aku, Salmon Connections, San Evo, Sarn, Scanline City, Seymour, Segfault, Senpai Please, Cyril XP Greg, Shader Bunny, Shazzy, Shitsu Supreme, Shinjutsu 1600, Shiny, Shmup Junkie, True, Simply Chrono, Sirapong, Skater to Employ, Social Kid, Sophisticated, Space, Spagward, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synthmilk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, Ted Ray 77, The Dirty Screech, The Kachow, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tom McCarthy, Tim French, T Money, Tofu Man, Tom Faze, Travis Arbon, Tristan, Sugumo, Turam, 2YU, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Typoair, Urokeeper, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vandal, Velenix, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vincetti Brincy, Wizard 16, Vlad STG, Wabbylegs, What Is This? William Miller, William Wallace, Yakiback, Yellow Tello, Your Nerdy Joe, Yeastbird, Zachary Patton, Zach Zenryoku, Zingus, Zerolux, Zorpnods.